We're going to talk a little about some research we've been doing on. I do quite a bit of research generally on leadership, and more recently focused specifically on what leaders do around safety that actually works. And we've had this for a long time. We've talked about safety leadership, and you hear it over and over again. And the problem is nobody ever says what that means, right? So we just, I don't know. To me, it's like vitamin A. I don't know what it is. I know I'm supposed to take it. Right? It's just vaguely defined, leadership, something. So we want to try to get to a more detailed presentation. So I have some ideas based on our research, but what was interesting is throughout the day, as I was listening to the presentations, I was going through my checklist, waiting for people to say things in my model, and I think we've covered them all off, so I'm very happy. So I will start with some research. About, in the mid-90s, we started doing some work on safety. And one of the first things that struck me in the very first study we did was we asked people about their perceptions of risk at the workplace and their participation in safety programs. And we asked about their own accident history and whether they'd been injured at work. And we also threw in a scale that measured whether they thought their supervisors and managers were committed to safety. And what really jumps out in that study for me is the effect of their perception of leaders is actually 3 times larger than their own accident history. So when we want to know who gets involved in safety, you would think, well, if I've had an accident, I'm more open to the message now. I recognize that it's important. It's actually the individuals who see their leaders as being very involved, very committed to safety, they take it on. Stuart said earlier, what my boss finds interesting, I find fascinating. This is true in safety as well. When we see our leaders get involved in safety and treated as a priority, we'll talk about what that might mean, that's when people tend to get involved. This is very consistent across all of the research literature in this area. Right? Safety leadership emerges over and over and over again, empirically, as a good predictor of safety outcomes. And we've heard today how leadership can change organizations. The Rear Admiral talked at lunch about making a change that Seaman Jimmy Hauser actually died aboard a ship because something wasn't done properly, and now they've fixed that. Right? That's a huge change. It affects everybody who's involved in that similar operation from that time forward. We saw earlier some data from Paula Burnett at Canada Post, and you see, I don't know if you were watching the percentages column on some of those charts, but there was some big decreases in accident frequency. For the Halifax sorting plant, it was an 80% decrease. Let me repeat that. It's an 80% decrease. Right? That's what we're doing. If you went in and said, here's what I plan to do. I plan to reduce safety incidents by 80%, people would say, you're nuts. Get something more realistic. Right? Just amazing. So Stuart introduced today, we were talking about leadership, focus, and discipline. Right? I want to talk specifically about the leadership aspect of that, but I think focus and discipline are a big part of being a good safety leader. So this is the hard question. What is leadership? This is my favorite definition. This comes from Scott Adams. He draws Dilbert. In his first book, he said, leadership's an intangible quality with no definition. It's probably a good thing because if the people being led knew the definition, they would hunt down their leaders and kill them. That's actually kind of true in a way, isn't it? Right? We heard some definitions today. Stuart talked earlier about leaders being passionate. If there was a theme here, when we had leaders talk about their safety involvement, that's what it was for me. When we heard the Admiral speak, he wasn't speaking about, the 500-page reports that they have and all the standard operating procedures that they've developed. He talked about a very personal incident he experienced and how that translates into his everyday. Right? Talk about being believable. Being passionate is part of being believable. Setting priorities. So we heard about the Comox seafood plant and CKF and how they make safety their number one. So I would argue, in most organizations, including yours, safety is not number one. Safety isn't even on the list yet. There's a whole bunch of things come before it. I have a colleague, Mark Fleming, who always says his test for safety is when he goes in the organization, he wants to know where the safety manager parks. Because if safety is really important, you get a designated parking spot. You go to St. Mary's, the president has a designated parking spot. He's the only one. He's the most important. I'm not sure that's the test, but putting safety number one is a new idea, really. It may not be new. Well, of course safety is number one. Safety is important. We all know that. Certainly when I go to safety conferences and we have this thing where we preach to the converted about how important safety is, and it's full of safety people, they've already got that message. They all know that safety is number one. But we have to think about, what does that mean to put safety number one? How do we get safety on the list? I think we've heard some good examples, and I'll try to point to them. But one of them, certainly, Paula didn't actually use these words, so I'm taking some liberty because Paula was one of our EMBA students at St. Mary's several years ago, and I taught her, so I had coffee with her the other day and asked her about the safety changes. And what she really emphasizes is personal accountability. For herself, as the director of that operation, she takes accountability for the safety of the organization. She expects every one of her 7 managers to do the same. She's created procedures for that to happen. But that's what leadership is. It's standing up and saying, I am responsible for this. So 3 things that I think we've learned about leadership. First of all, leadership's a verb. It's not a noun, it's not a title. Always drives me crazy. I do some work with our local healthcare groups, and they'll often phone you up and the conversation goes, Kevin, can you come and talk to our leadership on next Tuesday? That makes no sense to me. That's like saying, come talk to my jogging, right? Saying, what the hell are you talking about, right? Because they're using leadership to refer to their upper echelon, their top 40 or their senior leaders in the organization. I don't think leadership has anything to do with that. Leadership has to do with what you do. And we've heard it. I was sitting down in the back all day making notes. So, Stuart talked about moving from knowing to caring. That doesn't require a job title. It doesn't require a certain position, right? But it does require doing something. So we can know lots of things. I tell you, my training is I'm an organizational psychologist. So one thing I always like to announce, because I come from that background, Freud was wrong. Freud said self-knowledge leads to behavioral change. That's wrong. Knowing something does not mean you change your behavior, right? I know that eating at Tim Hortons makes people fat. It doesn't stop me. Knowledge does not lead to behavior change. You need something else. Bob Westhaver talked about making I love that line, making the safety program live. He said you can have the most well-designed program. You can put all the principles in place. You can have all the safe working procedures. You can have binders and binders of this stuff, and most of us do. And then how do you make it actually come to life? How do you make it so it's an integral part of the way we do our business? That takes more than sitting in a back room writing out safe working procedures. And Mr. Gauthier talked about, he used that line several times today, finding the burning platform, finding the thing that can motivate you to take on this issue. You're on a burning platform, you'll recognize the need for immediate behavioral change. Right? To find that thing that can motivate you and that you can use to motivate others. How do we actually put this stuff in practice? Because we know what to do. The what is fine. You can buy great textbooks on safety. Well, you can only buy one. Oh, right, I wrote it. But they're for sale in the lobby. And no. We have textbooks on how to do this. We have all kinds of procedures, and that they don't make the workplace any safer. until somebody actually enacts it and starts putting it into practice. So leadership is about us, each one in this room, changing our behavior. You know, if we go back tomorrow and we do the same things and we expect the workplace to be safer, isn't that Einstein's definition of insanity? Doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different outcome? Not a good place to be. Leadership is also personal. Leadership is about personal relationships with other people. Now, amazingly enough, there's a great parallel, because so is safety. When we're talking about safety, we're talking about someone's life. We're talking about the real possibility that someone doing a routine exercise that we've done hundreds and hundreds of times loses his hand. And his entire career has changed, his entire life has changed. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about safety. We don't often think that when we're in, you know, especially those of us who work in offices where, you know, the safety issues are paper cuts or, you know, maybe some exposure to the photocopier toner or something like that. We don't process that the, you know, people are working in very hazardous environments, and it's critical that we get this right. We, again, and the parallel just struck me, leadership is much like this. Because, you know, there's good data now. I'll tell you very quickly my favorite leadership study. That doesn't really deal with safety, but deals with the importance of leadership. So, group of researchers in England set up a study where they follow 12 nurses. No, let me rephrase that. They don't follow 12 nurses. They have 12 nurses wear ambulatory blood pressure monitors all day long, right? So if you've ever seen these blood pressure cuff battery pack on in a hard drive, takes your blood pressure every half hour or whatever you set it to. So the setup was, in this hospital, the nurses worked 12-hour shifts, supervisors worked 8-hour shifts. So 2/3 of the way through their shift, they changed supervisors. One of their supervisors they thought was a fair, reasonable person. The other one, they used another word. Good, you're with me. I was afraid I'd have to spell that out. My mother would say, "be with an itch." I think that's how she gets around it. Anyways, they didn't care for the other supervisor, was the point. And the researchers' questions was, what happens when you switch from a good supervisor to a bad supervisor, or vice versa? And what happens is your blood pressure shoots up. Your systolic blood pressure goes up by 16 points, your diastolic by 9 points. That translates into a 16% increase in your chance of a heart attack and a 38% chance increase for a stroke. So all those times you've gone home and said to your partner, "Oh, that so-and-so boss is just killing me," who knew? Turns out to be exactly right. So maybe leadership has more to do with safety than we might think. So if leadership means doing stuff, it's a verb, it also means doing the right things. And that's the critical thing we have to get to today is, what are those critical things that leaders can do? And by leaders, I mean each and every one of us. What can we do tomorrow to improve safety in our workplace? Right? So I'll show you a model we've been working on, Daniel and I. Daniel just sat up and started taking notes because it's not the model he thought it was. I changed it last night. Right? We talk about safer leadership. Talk about the importance of speaking about safety, talking the talk. Acting as if you believe what you're saying, you got to walk the walk. You have to focus. If you listen to the stories we've heard all day, nobody said, "I waved a magic wand and things got better." Instead, people talked about years of effort, sustained effort, resulting in change. We talk about engagement. You can't do it yourself. You have to get other people involved. And we talk about recognition. We have to recognize when people are getting it right, and as the Admiral pointed out at lunch, we have to recognize when people are getting it wrong, and we have to respond to those two eventualities. So we heard about the importance of speaking about safety, And we've had great examples all day. People got up, they told stories. People were hardwired to remember stories. You'll remember the story long after you remember the point. I used to teach an HR class, and when we taught about human rights law and discrimination in employment and in hiring, I would teach the Canada Human Rights Code, which is group-based discrimination. So the example I always used in class, local firm in the Atlantic Canada that I used to work or do some work for years ago, and they had many strange hiring practices, some of which I think were illegal, and we tried to avoid those. But one that I never quite got over is they refused to hire people with red hair. I'm looking around the room seeing how much trouble I'm going to get into. So, because they said people with red hair are temperamentally unstable. I have 2 brothers with red hair. I'm with them. My brothers are nuts, right? I believe this implicitly. So the point is, I tell my students this as an example of discrimination, but it's actually legal discrimination. The group-based human rights code doesn't protect redheads, right? It outlines the protected grounds. So I'd use that as my example, and on the exams, my TAs would always come back to me and say, Kevin, I don't know what they're talking about. They keep going on about how it's legal to discriminate against redheads. And they remembered the story, even when they didn't remember the principle. If you test me, you're free to do this. If you see me on the street a month from now, walk up to me and ask me who Jimmy Hauser is, and I bet you I can tell you. We remember stories. We should ask questions. Paula Burnett, in her presentation, talked about beginning every meeting. This is the greatest thing in the world. I think we could revolutionize safety if we could convince every senior manager to do this. Every meeting begins with, tell me about safety. What's going on? What do our numbers look like? Have we had any incidents? What are we doing about it? Ask those questions at every meeting. Rudy Giuliani, when he was mayor of New York, he wrote a book afterwards on leadership based on his response to 911. But prior to that, he became well known for some other things, one of which was cleaning up street crime in Manhattan. And in his book, he talks about how he did it. He said every week he met with the 5 borough chiefs, the police chiefs of the 5 boroughs in New York, and he said, tell me about street crime. Go one by one through your districts, tell me what's going on and what you're doing about it. So what does that do when you start just that conversation at the senior table? Every one of those chiefs went back to the borough, gathered all the deputy chiefs together and said, next week he's going to ask me this, get me the answers. And every one of them went out to their captains and said, the chief wants this, get me that. And it trickles through the organization. So phrase, and I missed who said it, but a phrase we often use in management is, you can't measure what you can't manage. I'll tell you the secret that employees learn just like that, the stuff you measure is the important stuff. The more we get into tracking safety very explicitly and in every senior meeting, so everyone's going around saying, tell me about safety, tell me what's going on, the more we start sending that message that this is actually important. Right? There's not a manager in the world in the private sector who would let sales fall dramatically without asking why. Right? Those figures are brought to the senior table all the time. In the same way, we need safety to get to that table. We need to start doing more data analysis. When you start asking those questions and start digging into the data, you're both finding out stuff about your organization, but you're also signaling that this is important stuff that we're actually going to look at. Right? Because if I never ask about safety, I never talk about safety, I don't care what the numbers say, what am I saying about safety? I'm saying it's not important. We did a study years ago. I told you I was going to drone on about research. We did a study years ago where we looked at the notion of passive safety leadership. Because I thought, well, you know, most of us in organizations, we may not be the safety champions or the safety advocates, but we're not telling people to hurt themselves. You know, there's no one at my university handing out scissors saying, here, run up and down the hallways with these. You know, we're not doing, you know, I mean, there are some people giving some pretty wonky instructions, but for the most part, we're quite happy if everybody's safe. Right? So we don't really teach them not to be safe, we just don't talk about it. So we did this study, I said, what would happen if you had a leader like that? If you had a leader who just didn't talk about safety, didn't do anything about it, just ignored the whole topic? And my hypothesis was that good leaders would improve safety, but this, we called it passive leadership, wouldn't have any effect at all. I thought the graph would be just a straight line that, you know, I shouldn't tell this story, but we had a priest back home, I'm from Cape Breton, and on Ash Wednesday when they give you the ashes, if he knew you and nobody was near, when you came up, he'd say, can't do you any harm, won't do you any good. Right? Well, that's what I thought passive leadership would be. Not going to hurt you, maybe not going to do you any good. Exactly wrong. What we found out is if you have a passive leader, if you have someone who doesn't care about safety, doesn't talk about it, doesn't act like if it's important, you actively destroy the safety climate of the organization. And the employees will tell you, safety's not important here. We don't care about safety. Right? So just by not talking about it, even if the manager really cares about safety, just hasn't done anything, hasn't signaled the importance. Dov Zohar, one of the leading researchers on safety climate, in his most recent research, I heard him present at a conference, what he's doing is having employees report back to him every time they have a conversation with their supervisor. And then he has researchers code those conversations. He goes to the supervisors and says, did you know you've talked to 42 of your employees, you've had 42 conversations with your direct reports last week, and none of them dealt with safety. Do you think that's a problem? He's just trying to get people feedback on their own behavior. Not enough to talk about safety, we have to act like it's something that's important. Right? So first we have to model the behavior. When we take time out from a meeting to say, let's talk about safety first. Right? When Rick began the day by saying, let's talk about first how to get out of this room if the place bursts into flames, we're modeling the type of concern that we want to see. And we start to create that accountability. Right? We can make safety an explicit consideration. Because, you know, if you're a manager, if you work in an office, if you're not the safety person, you say, what's this to me? You know, I sit in an office and I make decisions. What about if we built safety into every decision? What if every time we decided to do something, we said, what are the safety implications of that? We often advocate to people in safety leadership training, we often talk about doing a pre-mortem. You know what a post-mortem is? Well, a pre-mortem is, let's look around. We'll look around the room. If someone's going to get hurt, how's that going to happen? Let's fix that. If we keep doing that, we're both showing that this is important to us, and we're actually fixing some stuff. We had a wonderful story from Rear Admiral Newton at lunch, where he talked about being a junior officer and questioning the result of a board comprised of senior officers, saying this is wrong. That takes a lot of guts. Right? I mean, frankly, not in my environment. I have tenure. They can't promote me, they can't fire me. I'm good. But for people who have real jobs, right, you don't question the senior people. You certainly don't do it when you're junior. If there's anything we know about junior employees, they're trying to fit in and make their way through the ranks and, you know, build a career for themselves. You don't do that necessarily by rocking the boat all the time. That's a bad phrase for the Navy, isn't it? Anyways, but to be able to call people on their behavior, what do you do if you see someone doing something unsafe? Any one of us, what do we do? A lot of us walk by. Right? Now, if you're Stuart McLean, you run the WCB, you walk into the manager of Crown Rust Control and you tell him, go fix that. But most of us don't do that. But we should. we had, you know, like every university in the infrastructure program, we had all this construction going on at the university, and all of a sudden there's all these workers around, and that's when we start, those of us who do safety stuff start noticing that, you know, you see guys up on the platforms repointing the brick, and they're all wearing their fall protection, but none of it's clipped on. And they just wear it because if an inspector drives by, he'll see the brightly colored fall protector. So what do you do about that? I was having some renovations done to my home, and the electrician came to put a new panel in, and he had an apprentice with him. And at one point, as I walked by the room, I heard the apprentice say, "Do you always work on a live panel like that? Because they taught us to lock it out." And the journeyman that was teaching this young person said, "In the real world, you learn to do it this way." So I'm a jerk. I went in and said, in my world, you shut it down, you lock it out. Because I'm not willing to take that chance. But you think when someone does something like that and they're not called on it, they're not only putting themselves in harm's way, they're now teaching someone probably the most dangerous thing you can do in that profession. And you're just passing that on, right? So we need to start standing up and calling people when they do something unsafely. We need to create accountability. We heard about a Canada Post doing a leadership scorecard. We talked about the importance of having role clarity and defining our roles. We've talked a lot throughout the day about the, if I can use the term, the technicalities of safety, of how you put a safety program together. And there are checklists and there are procedures, and we are probably really good at this. We're not as good as we should be. Because I'm thinking, why aren't the claims processed the same day they're filed? I don't, you know, there's this new thing, it's called email, really fast. So I don't get that. But, so there's things certainly we can improve in safety, in the procedures, but we also need to create those accountability procedures so that somebody is responsible. Somebody has, along the way, has to stand up and say, this is my job. I actually think this, I have to say this quickly because this is the last time anyone from WCB will ask me to do anything, because I think one of the things we teach in safety commonly is actually the wrong message, because what we say all the time is safety is everybody's responsibility. And I get the point of that. There's a role for management, there's a role for employees, there's a role for unions, there's a role for government. I get that. But you know what? Someone's got to be accountable for that too. When we say, oh, safety is everybody's business, often that, I think, diffuses the responsibility. I think we're much better off when people take responsibility. So we need to build that focus because it's going to go over a long period of time. The Admiral talked about having a thematic focus, about focusing on specific areas and understanding the hazards, for example, in diving. What are the risk factors? What are the hazards? What are the procedures? How can we make that a safer thing to do? And that's a separate area of focus all by itself. And then you do that across 20, 30 areas, right, to get that really depth sort of perception on what's going on. And the big thing, of course, is safety isn't a program. Safety is not something we roll out for 3 weeks because it's safety month. And then we get back to real business. Safety has to get ingrained in everything we do. That's the leader's role. We talk about engaging others. Stuart said leadership comes from everybody. Admiral Newton said leadership is us. We heard a lot of talk about building partnerships at Canada Post, internally with your JOSH committees, with your internal specialties, your workplace disability managers, and the experts that you have on staff. Also building partnerships here, externally, with the WCB, with other agencies, many of whom will be, maybe in this case, operating in the same framework, maybe experiencing the same difficulties, the same problems. I worry a lot about the notion of safety champions, because so here's what happens. When someone champions something in an organization, great things happen. At St. Mary's, we have an executive MBA program. Do you know why? Colin Dodds wanted it. Nobody else did. When he was Dean of Commerce, he thought it would be really cool if we had an executive MBA program. Let's start one. And most of the other faculty looked at him and said, yeah, you're nuts. But he kept pushing it, and he drove it forward and drove it forward. He created the program. We have a Master's in Finance program that was created because Francis Boabang wanted one. All it took is one person to make that change. That's a great thing. So my worry about that is, well, it actually didn't happen in those cases. But what happens is the champion can create something, but you need to get other people involved or it dies. Because if the EMBA had stayed just Colin Dodds, then when he moved on, became academic vice president, now he's the president, the program would have died because he has a different focus. Or the Masters in Finance will die when Francis Boabang eventually retires. Or your safety program will die because your safety champion moves on to another job. We need to get other people involved. The Admiral talked about walking around, listening to junior people. Right? When we're doing things like that, we're getting other people involved in the safety process. Safety can't be the responsibility of just the safety officer. Right? We need to build that community in our own workplace. Last but not least, this is the part I just added, because it's something we often forget. We have to recognize people's behavior. Now, I very explicitly say recognize, not reward, because what happens, and I apologize if you're from that area, I teach HR myself, but I have no respect for them. And I'm sorry. So here's what HR departments do. They take that very good notion of recognition and they say, we'll create a rewards and recognition program. Right? And the minute they said rewards, my heart started to sink a little because they're going to mess this up. There is a company in Halifax, I'm not allowed to tell you who they are, but they have a recognition program where they teach supervisors to recognize their employees. Very good thing. Do you know how they do it? It's a very stressful job, by the way. And the staff are mainly overworked, and they have purchased what they call the supervisor's toolkit. It's actually a wooden toolbox like carpenters used to carry, and they have it filled with chiclets and little bars, bags of chips, and supervisors are expected to take this and walk around to recognize people by giving them a chiclet. So I'm from Cape Breton. You'd be told where you could put the chiclet. So we messed it up. So what's recognition? Best book on recognition ever, which I get no royalties on, it really annoys me. Best book ever, you've probably read it, The 1 Minute Manager. Hersey and Blanchard, sometime in the mid-70s. If you haven't read it, you can buy it at any used bookstore for $1, because there's thousands of copies out there. They talked about doing 1 minute recognition. They said, look, when you see someone doing something right, you should go over to them. The one thing I'll update a little, they said you should go over to them, you should make some contact, like put your hand on their shoulder. Okay, new century, no touching. Okay, we're very clear on this, right? No touching. But you should go over to them and say, Daniel, I saw the way you did this. That's great, thank you. That's it. That's recognition. And if they messed up, then maybe you should take them in private, because you shouldn't really discipline people in public. And you should give them some feedback. Now, feedback is not what I call, we have a tendency to give what I call Cape Breton feedback, which is, it begins with, what kind of idiot are you? Right? You don't need to do that. You just stay with the behavior. You say, look, Daniel, I saw how you did this. Here's why that's incorrect. Here's how I'd like to you to handle it next time. And you leave it at that. Hersey and Blanchard said if you can do those two things, you've got 80% of management mastered. Right? We heard the Admiral talk about consequence management and providing feedback, but I think everything he said is right. Didn't go far enough. Because here's the part we get wrong. We are very clear, if you do something wrong, you will hear about it. We've got that. You need no training in that whatsoever. You already know your employee screws up, you know what to do about it. What happens if they don't? What happens if they don't mess up? What happens if they don't do anything unsafe, that they in fact follow the best safety practices in your organization? What do? We do this. We do nothing. So now we're in a process where the only time anyone ever talks to me about safety is when I've done something wrong. Over time, I might try to avoid those conversations because they're never going to work out well for me. I give you a good test for, you can test your organization on this. Tomorrow morning you're going back to work, I presume, or the next day or whenever. So when you get back to work and you walk in and that little red light on your phone is beeping because you have a phone mail, and you pick it up and your boss has left a message saying, come and see me the minute you get in. How many of you are thinking, oh boy, something good's happening? Right, that's the problem. We hear about the bad stuff, but not the good stuff. We have half of consequence management. See, this is a real problem in safety because the consequence of doing everything right is nothing. The consequence of doing something wrong, someone loses a limb, someone dies, someone gets injured, someone's off on workers' comp. The consequence of doing it right is absolutely nothing. Nothing happens. Part of our job has to be to make something happen, to start telling people when they're doing something right. Hersey and Blanchard said this should be in proportion, right? This is the notion of giving contingent feedback. So if you buy the 80-20 rule, right? That means 80% of your employees are doing something right. That means 80% of your time should be spent telling people that they're doing good things. And maybe 20 spent dealing with the other thing. If you're a manager, you know that's not how it works. You spend 90% of your time dealing with the people who messed up, and you never talk to the people who are doing the right things. That's the wrong model. We have to start changing that. Even in my workplace, I think we have a pretty good safety program. We have a very dedicated safety officer who does all the right things. If she's walking through, she sees an electrician overbalancing on a ladder, she calls them on it right away. If they're not wearing fall harnesses, she calls it, she'll shut down work, she called the supervisors. She gets actively involved. But even she, as good as she is, if she walks by people who are doing something, some rewiring, and they're doing everything right, she doesn't tell them that. So safety becomes a really aversive experience for most of us, because the only time we hear about it is when we get it wrong. Right? So we need to provide that balance of feedback, both good feedback and bad feedback, but probably more good than bad, because most of our employees are doing the right things. Right? That's how our organizations keep running. I'm never ever saying ignore the bad stuff. I'm saying keep it in perspective and balance it with what people are actually doing. My other favorite safety story, by the way, because we had all this construction work going on campus, I attended a toolbox talk. Has anyone done that? I've never done that before. So toolbox talk, often on construction sites, is the supervisor will gather people together and they'll spend like 15 minutes talking about something safety related. So the particular one I sort of dropped in and eavesdropped on, the supervisor seemed like otherwise a normal, sane individual, had a group of carpenters around him and was reading the 26 steps involved in using a power saw. Imagine how exciting that was for them all. Right? It was the most useless thing I've ever seen in my life. And again, you know, what kind of message does this send? It says safety is something, yeah, it's not relevant to what we do. It's sort of, you know, we have to do it because, well, Stewart's around and workers' comp will come get us, or the Department of Labor will send inspectors. We have to do it, but it's not really important. It's the wrong message. So during the Admiral's presentation, I came up with my own definition of what safety leaders should be doing to be effective. This is my version, or a similar version of the James Reason safety model, the Swiss cheese model. I think our job as leaders is to move the cheese slices. Because integral to that model is the injuries, the accidents happen when all of those systems fail. Our job is to make sure that doesn't happen. If we push one of those cheese slices to the side, the causation can't happen. That means we have to design the best systems we have, but then we need to back them up. I think the Admiral talked about inspecting the inspections. That's part of that process. We have to have some personal accountability and personal awareness that puts another layer of cheese up there. Because when we don't do that, then we have to start talking about disability management. And we're all much better off if we're talking about prevention and not disability management. Thank you very much.